Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and tonight I'm excited to bring some of my colleagues from Symmetry Solutions to have a conversation about spiritual framings that we feel might be helpful in regards to kind of taking a perspective within Mormonism. Anyway, I'll frame that up in just a minute a little bit better than I just did, but feel free in this whole process to ask us questions, to interact with us on the comments. We'll try to kind of keep track as we talk and have you share with us some of your thoughts or perspectives, either questions or comments about what we're saying. Also, just a little bit about Mormon Mental Health Podcast. It is a podcast that is dependent on the support of listeners. So if you find these podcasts valuable, please consider a donation at mormonmentalhealth.org. Very easy button. You can just push a one-time donation or kind of monthly, if you can send $10, $50, $100 a month our way, it really helps make this podcast viable and financially sustainable in the long haul. We cover all kinds of things mental health on this podcast. We have a mixture of professionals and individuals who come on and tell their stories, or professionals who kind of share some of their expertise on typical topics that come up for, I think, the audience in general. But, I think in our culture and in our kind of religious tradition, there's certain quirks or ways that we consider things differently. So kind of having a Mormon spin on a lot of things mental health. So consider that. As far as announcements, I can't think of any right now, other than if you're interested in any of the other things I'm doing, you can always visit my website at natashaparker.org. That's where you can find information about my online private practice, Symmetry Solutions. You can also find information on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis, which is for those who are experiencing faith transitions or their families or friends who need support through things like that. So there's lots of different resources depending on what you're interested in, you can find on my website. So without further ado, we'll get started. And I want to introduce Jana Spangler, who's been on the show before, and she's a wellness coach at Symmetry Solutions. A new provider to Symmetry Solutions, who is Jenny Elledge. So I'm going to have both of them just have a minute to introduce themselves. Jana, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you, Natasha. I'm happy to be back. I am a life coach at Symmetry Solutions. I'm a trained integral professional coach, and my practice has a broad range of clients, but I would say that the majority are people dealing with changes in their faith and needing support through the difficulties of that, and also mixed faith marriages.
Perfect. Thank you. And Jenny, this is your first time to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me. So my name is Jenny, and I live in sunny Florida. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I work with individuals, I work with couples, I work with families. And a lot of what I work with are clients who are dealing with mixed faith marriages, mixed faith families. We have anxiety, depression, sometimes a little ADHD going on there too. And I'm happy to be a part of tonight's podcast.
Awesome. So let me just set up the conversation a little bit as far as what we're hoping to cover. So as mental health professionals and as wellness coaches, we typically know through the research that people find in general great support, great kind of framings through spiritual practice, through their religious beliefs. And this is kind of true across the spectrum of different types of religions. So in general, religion tends to be, for a lot of people, a healthy part of their lives. And I think many Mormons would say that's true of their relationship with their religion. And at the same time, we also know that, like, for example, around general conference or things of that nature, we tend to see an uptick in amongst Mormon mental health professionals or professionals who treat Mormon clientele. We tend to see an uptick on kind of, people kind of calling in with either anxiety or family disputes or relationship issues due to faith transitions or a variety of things after certain events such as General Conference. And I'm not exactly sure about the research on this, but I've heard, at least anecdotally, from professionals who work at the Utah Crisis Centers, the suicide hotlines, that they expect larger amounts of calls during General Conference weekend. So these kinds of things kind of, fit together, right? So on the one hand, religion and faith communities can be a great support, can be a great sense of comfort, can really help people have identity, can help people have meaning in life. And then on the other hand, faith communities and religions can also be a little bit of pressure cookers. They can be a kind of a little bit of a space for perfectionistic thinking or all or nothing thinking. And people can get in trouble with either disagreeing with people in their, family or community, or kind of being very hard on themselves, depending on how they interpret some of the things that are coming across the pulpit. So one thing that we thought we would do is come up with a list of what we find to be potential. We're not saying that these are going to be, we're going to say they're potential aspects within Mormon theology or Mormon outlook on faith and religion that could be on the healthy way of looking at things, so that you can frame things that you hear or consider things that you hear through some of these things that we have within our own Mormon construct. Now, as we do this, we had a lot of discussion prior to this that we want to be very careful, because one of my huge pet peeves, if anybody knows me, and the whole reason I founded the Mormon Mental Health Association, is that one of my huge pet peeves is when therapists overstep their bounds, or coaches, wellness coaches, overstep their bounds into religious territory in inappropriate ways. And a very simple way that I'll just give an example that happened to me and one of my sons right here in Wichita, Kansas, which is very evangelical and very Christian based. We went to go see a therapist who happened to be a Christian. I didn't know that when I set up the appointment, but in the middle of one of our appointments, he says to my son, well, I don't think that God would want you to think that way. And this was prior to any conversation about whether or not we believed in God, whether or not we found God to be a helpful entity in our lives, whether or not we, even considered God. He imposed his idea of God and even the presence of God as a foregone conclusion, and therefore imposing his own, ideas onto us. And that's a very inappropriate thing that happens a lot of times with a variety of therapists. It can happen on the other side too, with, secular therapists who kind of never consider the spiritual aspects or never ask about religious ideas of their clients. So kind of assume that those things aren't important. So it can go either way. So I want to make sure that as we start this conversation, we are having this conversation from the context that all three of us are very culturally competent in Mormonism. We understand the language. All three of us come from a Mormon background in one way or another. All of us, but this has nothing to do with our current relationship with Mormonism, our current belief system. We are just framing this in a way from the mental health hat that we're wearing and the wellness hat that we're wearing, not our religious hats, because that's for us to deal with at church or with our own, with our own private parts of ourselves, not within the public forum. So I'm hoping I'm making myself clear on that. Any comments, Jana or Jenny, just as I set this whole thing up, or ways that you can clarify what I'm saying? Because I feel like I'm jumbling my own words.
No, that seems pretty clear to me, Natasha.
Okay.
You're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. All right. So having said that, we are going to, if I can find my little list here of things, we thought about a top 10 list, but we couldn't stop. So we came up with 15, 15 concepts that we believe exist in a Mormon framing that may be helpful to people as they try to navigate their relationship within a Mormon framework, if that is what they're interested in doing, and if that's something that they would find useful. So lots of ifs there, right? So the number one, and we'll just kind of go through these. So I'll just say the number one. If you guys want to give context, you can, and then, we'll just take turns and go through the rest of them. So then the one that I thought of was, or one that we talked about, was we do have, believe it or not, in the dialogue of the church, that there is a possibility that church leaders make mistakes. Like that is actually something that's been talked about quite a bit. I can think of a talk that President Uchtdorf gave where he talked about the idea that sometimes, leaders talk as men and sometimes leaders talk as seers and prophets. And he's not the only one that has said things like that. We have quotes that really go all the way back to the founders on these types of topics. And we as a culture tend to struggle with knowing how to manage that, right? Because when are we supposed to know if they're talking like leaders, and when are they supposed to know when they're talking as people with biases? And historically, we tend to we tend to agree on that issue after a lot of time has passed. So like we could now all agree that probably Brigham Young was affected by racial bias on a lot of the things that he said about, Black people in this country. So, but in the moment, in the current time, that's harder to do. And that's, that's reasonable because we're all trying to honor and sustain, their positions. And we're trying to make sense of, information that we want to glean from leaders. But the reason I think that this is important is because if you're sitting there and something really doesn't sit well with you or your own personal experience, or you really feel like something isn't correct, that you feel like a leader is saying, there is the possibility that the leader could be wrong, right? And so it doesn't always have to be this story that a lot of people feel where, now I have to change, or I can't fit in, or I can't be part of this group because I have a different idea. Any further thoughts about that point?
Yeah, Natasha, I love the quote that Patrick Mason uses in the book Planted, and it makes me laugh every time, is that in the Catholic Church, they have in their theology the idea that the Pope is infallible, that none of the members believe it. And in Mormonism, we have the idea that our leaders are fallible, but none of the members believe it.
Right. So it's really good to tease ourselves, right? It's really healthy to tease ourselves.
I'm really good at teasing myself in all aspects, so I tease myself in this all the time. But I think it's something to think about, because I think that we are told, we've been told this many times in many general conferences and many talks, of the importance of getting our own personal revelation on any given subject. And but we're not really taught what to do when that perhaps comes up against, maybe you're feeling something, your personal revelation is telling you something different than what you're hearing from the pulpit. And that is a really, really difficult place to be. And we're not really very good at dealing with uncertainty. It feels so much better when we can just give that authority over to our leaders and say, you know what, I just do what they say and I'm safe. And that is a very safe place to be. It's also not a place of a ton of spiritual growth. And so, I just invite people to kind of think about how they can start doing a wrestle with some of these things, and maybe sit in an idea that maybe we don't know everything. Us, the prophet, anyone, have a little bit of humility and some spiritual humility and some religious humility, and see what that feels like, just to say, you know what, this doesn't feel right to me, and I'm not sure I know why, but I'm willing to just keep having questions.
Yeah, thank you. And you're kind of jumping right into one of our other points, which is that idea of personal revelation. So Jenny, did you have anything to say about leaders? And then maybe I'll have you take over that point of personal revelation.
Yeah, for, the leader giving a message to a body in the church who is many millions strong could be difficult to reach every single individual there. That message may not resonate with every single member of that church, and it's okay. That's okay to not quite resonate with the message that's being given.
That reminds me of, I'm not sure if she came up with it or if she was repeating somebody else's idea, but Julie Day Azevedo Hanks, one time I heard her say something like, general conference is about general guidelines, right? It has the word general in it. And so it's a site kind of like what you're saying, Jenny, when they're addressing, millions of people, they're giving kind of general principles. And then we're supposed to kind of, liken those unto our own personal situations, which is where that idea of personal revelation can also be very helpful, because it gives some sense of personal autonomy over how some of these principles can be interpreted, and hopefully they can be interpreted in ways that help people instead of harm people within their situation. So yeah, I love that. So do you want to talk about the concept of personal revelation, Jenny? You want to start us off with that?
Oh, Mormonism is very big on personal revelation, aren't they? They love to talk about personal revelation. We don't talk a lot about when personal revelation is different than what we hear over the pulpit, though. But yeah, this idea of, it goes along with the idea of agency, which I think we're going to get into later, but that we as grown-ups get to have our own personal authority to decide what works for us. We get to have this personal relationship with God, with how we see God in our life, and that's what makes it personal, right? So personal revelation can be quite different than what we hear over the pulpit.
Yeah, I really like that idea that it is difficult in the group talk to be comfortable with everybody coming up with their own personal ideas. So in the group, when we, which is maybe Sunday school or the ward sacrament meeting or the general conference, you're going to hear a message that kind of conforms to the overall group. And yet, Mormonism is fairly, I don't know if unique, but one of the things that I think we talk about thinking is unique about Mormonism is that there is this room for personal relationship with God, personal prayer, personal answers. And, for one person, for example, the decision to divorce or to marry or to how they're going to manage with a faith transition may differ very differently than somebody else in the very same ward. And so we do have room for that in our theology, even though I think there is some anxiety that presents when you raise your hand and speak up. Like, oh, by the way, my personal revelation doesn't quite fit with what Elder so-and-so just said, right? Or things of that nature. Jen, any thoughts about personal revelation? Well, you spoke about it a little bit already, but maybe you have something else to add.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I have a quote here to back this up. This is actually Bruce R. McConkie. So mark it. I don't quote him much, but here we go. Here he is. We talk about Latter-day prophets. We think in terms of prophets who tell the future destiny of the church and the world. But in addition to that, the fact is that every person should be a prophet for himself in his own concerns and in his own affairs. And I think this speaks to something that we've already said, but I'll even make it more general than general conference, which is that each person, the belief is that each person has a mantle and they speak for the people who they have jurisdiction, in their callings. But it is also general revelation. It's general inspiration for that group. And it is very important for each of us to have that personal revelation. And Bruce R. McConkie is not the only person to have talked about this. Joseph Fielding Smith talked about this. Joseph Smith talked about this, about each person being a prophet in their own affairs, which means that the ultimate responsibility lies with us. And we do have that freedom within the scope of the way Mormonism is taught.
Yeah, I really like that. And Jennifer West, who's joining us, says that's a Broussard quote that I can get behind. So I agree. I think everybody's got to have at least a few quotes that we can get behind, right? I would use myself that one of the people I find myself quoting a lot is Packer, even though I was also grumpy with Packer quite a bit. But I still quote him. I give him credit where credit's due. So yeah, so that's a helpful concept. Again, when for those of you who are maybe just joining us, we're thinking about concepts within Mormonism that can propel mental health, that can offer the flexibility needed to have well-being within a religious structure versus some of the things that are unhelpful. And we're coming at this kind of from a mental health wellness perspective here on Mormon Mental Health Tonight. So feel free to make comments, ask questions along the way, etc. All right, so that takes us to number 3, which you're kind of already jumping into, which is this idea of agency. So we are, we have this story in Mormonism that agency is super important. That, if we're going to believe the Mormon story, we came from a place where, the pre-existence, where our choice, in fact, just the fact that we're here on this world kind of means that we had a choice. We had a choice to come here, and the choice was important. And that, the framing of the Mormon God is that he wasn't going to impose his will on us, that he was going to allow for us to learn for ourselves, grow for ourselves, choose for ourselves. So any thoughts about how the concept of agency can be helpful in healthier framings within Mormonism?
Yeah, I mean, I think agency is such a prime part of the theology that also gives us this freedom to understand that we are making our way on our own, again, with that guide of that personal revelation and with the guide of leadership. And lost my train of thought on that with agency. I mean, it's such a prime issue that we deal with. Maybe Jenny can talk while I try to get my thought back. I did have a thought. I really did. I promise.
That never happens to me. I never lose my train of thought.
I know. So my thought on agency is, like you were saying, Natasha, there was this plan. We were to come to Earth, and we were to get a body, experience life. And through those life experiences, we would learn and grow and progress, right? That's part of the whole plan. And contrary to that plan was Satan's plan that we would all be the same, and we would all make the same choices, and we would all get the same result. And so agency for me kind of goes along with being a little bit different than what you might see, around you, and being okay with that as well too. So long as you're resonating, and so long as you're cultivating that personal revelation with God as how you see it, is what we're really looking for. That's why agency is important, is that freedom to be able to explore that relationship.
And I really like this because so much of what we're inviting people to do in mental health settings, such as therapy or coaching sessions, is to tune into our will, our ideas, our desires, our wants, our needs, right? And to make sense of that kind of in a systemic space with our children, our spouses, our family members, because they all have competing needs and desires, and how do we make sense of that in a way that is helpful to the context of healthy lifestyles. So I really think that, and I tease us again in Mormonism that we tend, I tease especially when I talk about parenting, that we love Satan style of parenting. Make sure you're, on board with my way of thinking. This is the one and only way, and we know the results, and we're going to protect you from everything bad. And we tend to not be as comfortable with supposedly, heavenly parent style of parenting, which is more about choice and agency and differentiation and handling our own emotions when our children do different things. And so I think, again, culturally, it's important to think about how even though we may have agency as a concept within Mormonism, I don't think we do a very good job of promoting or honoring people's agency. For example, when maybe they decide they're going to take a different faith path, right? Or when they're going to take a marital path, like such as divorce, or they're going to take a path maybe where they're not choosing to have biological children, right? Or all these things that kind of tend to go a little bit against the grain of what is considered, the typical Mormon way, or not go on a mission, for example, or things of that nature. And so I think that even though we have it, we're not very good at seeing it or practicing it. And I think that's probably the true of all of the different points we're going to make tonight, is that we have it.
We have it.
We have it. We're inviting you to think about it. We're inviting you to frame, your discomfort or your sadnesses or difficulties around some of these concepts, because we think that there's some healthy perspectives here. But that doesn't mean that the group or the tribe is going to be going, hooray, we're so glad that you see it differently. Because we tend to be somewhat of a conforming tribe, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I got it back, Natasha.
Yes, Jana, your thought is back.
It was along the lines of what you said. I had written down, we're afraid to use it with our agency. So often we frame our discussions at church or, lessons around these really simple ideas as if we just need to be obedient and it's that easy. And we imagine that it's more like the Garden of Eden, where we've just got, all you need to do is just obey. And it's very simple what that means. But what we forget in that story is that they were giving at some point an impossible choice. They were, it was a paradoxical choice. They were going to have to make a decision one way or the other, and something was going to get violated either way. And that is more true to, I think, our lives. So often there's some really tough things out there. It's not just so easy as saying choose the right. I mean, who knows what that right is when you have a deep belief in what the brethren are telling us, maybe about our LGBT brothers and sisters, and then you have a child who is LGBT, and it really will challenge you on what that really means. What values do I hold dear? What do I think about obedience is a whole different conversation than should I steal the candy bar or not? I mean, and I think we need to recognize more often, first of all, the complexities of life, recognizing we're not going to do it all perfectly, and we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes, whether we follow our own heart or follow the brethren, we're going to get it wrong, no matter what we do. And so I think we need to also recognize that along with agency comes this idea that we're going to get things wrong. And so even in our hope to be obedient, sometimes we can get things wrong. And just having a little bit of grace for ourselves, and knowing that there's a huge part of Mormonism that is dedicated to what we do with that. There are ways to apply grace to our lives, and sometimes we forget that. So we get really nervous. What I see the fruits of this we get really nervous when our loved ones are maybe stepping out of what we see are the lines of obedience and using their free agency, when really our only hope for any kind of perfection in this life is to embrace our imperfection.
I love that. And again, Jennifer West says Adam and Eve made important choices. So she also brings up the Garden of Eden, using their agency in the garden, even when making choices that may at the time have seemed contrary to God's guidance, right? I usually like to say that, Mormonism is one of the only sects that I know of, Christian sects, that honors Eve for basically not following God's command, and that we still think that she did the, quote unquote, right thing of entering this land of knowledge. And it's interesting that right from the get-go, the Mormon story introduces paradox, which is going to be the next thing on our list that I'm going to bring up, is paradox, which is right away, you cannot have innocence and growth happen at the same time. You cannot have joy and pain, right? We have the opposition in all things kind of ideas in Mormonism, and that's necessary. That opposition in all things is necessary for growth. And so the idea that mistakes and regrets and all of those things were going to be part of the journey, that we weren't going to be able to get away from that. And therefore comes, kind of the whole plan of salvation and how we kind of formulate that in Mormonism. But that is quite different from a lot of Christianity, which really saw the Garden of Eden as the ideal place. That's where we should have all been, but they messed it up for the rest of us. And, and Eve has forever been kind of the seductress, horrible person that, messed it up for all mankind. So I'm way oversimplifying a lot of Christian thoughts here, but it is interesting that we make room for paradox in Mormonism right from the get-go. And I always point out that all of the interesting stories in the scriptures are about paradox. Do I cut off his arms or do I not cut off his arms? And when is it okay to cut off arms, right? Or when is it okay to lie and steal because of a bigger thing? I mean, there's all kinds of ways where people are in ethical dilemmas, moral and ethical dilemmas in the scriptures, and why we find them interesting. Otherwise, they'd be kind of boring stories, if you're just always going along with with what's easy, right? So it's people who have to choose between two usually correct principles. So do I, kind of like with the example you brought up, do I choose obedience and make sure that my child who is gay and married never visits our home or is able to stay in our home because, we don't want them to share a married bed in our home? Or do we choose love and acceptance and accept things that maybe go against our particular, values? So that's an ethical dilemma. And there's consequences to both of those choices, right? And I'm not going to say there's a wrong or right choice necessarily, but there are consequences to either one of those choices. And we're in ethical, moral dilemmas a lot. So any other thoughts about paradox?
Yeah, I love this idea of paradox. It's one that I've been working with a lot lately. And one of the things that I think paradox does for us as well is it breaks us out of this trying to make sense of everything with our brain. This is something that we love to do, is try to make sense of everything with our brain, when actually, if you think about it, spiritual experience with the divine, love, suffering, a lot of these subjects are not black and white kind of literal experiences. They're experiences that you have a hard time even putting into words. And so I love that the teachings of Jesus so often he taught in paradox, and I have a few written down. Finding is losing and losing is finding. The poor are rich and the rich are very poor. Hunger is satisfaction, satisfaction is emptiness. Weeping is bliss, bliss is weeping. They're all over, there are more on this list. But I think, so often we'll come across some of these, lose your life and to say that kind of things. And we scratch our heads trying to figure out, and then we try to spin around in our mind, what did that mean? What did that mean? But I think that Jesus was really trying to invite us into getting beyond our rational minds and just feeling, which is really the way that we access that personal revelation. So I think sitting in a paradoxical place and just seeing what happens when we scramble our rational minds and just feel into a subject, what kind of access that can give us to deeper growth.
Awesome. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, my thought is that as human beings, we tend to like to make correlation between things that may not necessarily exist. So we think if I'm obedient in all things, then I will get all good things. And oh, look, I got some bad things. So that must mean that I've been disobedient. So I'm going to increase more obedience and more of that behavior in order to get more good things. So that's where we have this idea of paradox again, that that's not necessarily correlated. It's not a causative factor. Obedience is just obedience. You can get good things with it, and you can also get some lousy things, not necessarily because of your obedience or lack of obedience as well.
Right. So kind of the classic equational approach oftentimes doesn't work, which is a form of a lot of times just trying to control outcomes. I mean, I think all of us want to, if we could, we'd like to control outcomes. We'd like to know what's coming around the corner. And a lot of times it just doesn't work that way. And the story of Job, I think, is a good reminder of that, that obedience isn't necessarily the panacea for correct outcomes, or at least what we think of as good outcomes. There can be a lot of pain and suffering through that type of, not that obedience was the problem in that story. I'm just saying that it doesn't equate to, what sometimes we would think it would equate to. All right. So the number 5 idea that we thought was interesting to bring up is that there's a lot of ongoing guidance, especially in the New Testament, and I would say even in the Book of Mormon, to really watch this tendency that we have of being judges of one another or of other people. Now, that doesn't mean to not be discriminatory, right? In the sense of sometimes we need to, and I mean that in a positive way, like sometimes we just need to discriminate, like risk or, assess, maybe is a better word. We need to be able to assess risk or assess different perspectives. But this idea that somehow we know where another person's coming from, or that we understand how their brain works or their challenges, or whether or not they're going to make it, to the celestial kingdom, for example. We hear a lot of talks about that. I hear a lot of people coming to me saying things like, my mother believes that I'm no longer going to make it to the celestial kingdom because, I no longer feel a certain way about a certain gospel principle or things like that. And I think a lot of times we make premature judgments on things that we really have very little understanding about, right? And I saw this somewhat with the conference with President Nelson's talk, which I found a lot of problems in his assumptions about what's going to be happening in the afterlife. But even in his talk, and even though he said it fairly condescendingly, and I didn't like his tone, he still did say, it's not my place to judge. Right? Or he said, I'm glad it's not my place to judge this individual that he was talking about in some story that, I think it was a gentleman who was asking for his work to be done after death or something. So he kind of chuckled and said, well, I'm glad it's not my place to judge. And I was like, I'm glad it's not your place to judge too, President Nelson. and it's none of our place, because we don't know anything about that man's personality, his, mental health issues, 500,000 things that we are not aware of, barely with ourselves. We're not even aware about these things for ourselves, much less for other people. So to come at any concept or conclusion that we know what's going to happen in the afterlife, I think is something that we're actually told not to do, not to worry about that, not to judge and make assumptions. So I think that can be a very helpful thing to remember when we find ourselves in conversations where we're making a lot of assumptions about family members or friends or ward members that can cause a lot of sadness, anxiety, and grief. So any thoughts about you shall not judge?
I have some thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
I really like the idea of embracing the idea of the mystery of God, or the mystery of heaven, or the mystery of the afterlife. Like, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. There's been a lot of, ideas put forth by different people about what it could look like, but we don't know, right? We're going by faith here. And if we can embrace this idea of there's a mystery here, and maybe one day we'll all figure it out, but we don't have to figure it out right now. Maybe then we can let go of maybe that fear of, oh, my loved one over here, this person is not going to make it, and I want this person with me. But if we can understand that, hey, we're all in the same boat, and we all are trying to figure this out, and we don't entirely know everything quite yet. Maybe we will one day. We got some time on our side, we've got eternity on our side, then we can feel a little bit better about being okay with where we are in our spiritual journey.
I love that. I love that. Although I don't know that we're very comfortable in mystery in Mormonism. We tend to like answers in Mormonism, but I think that there is a lot of mystery, and I love that idea that we can make room for possibility with mystery. So yeah, Jana.
Yeah, I just think I would add, so many clients that I speak to have this recognition that I shouldn't care what other people think. And yet we all really do. I mean, it's really hard for us. And I think as we get older, we get better at this. I think just naturally, time teaches us things, but it's a really hard one. It's one we all really struggle with. So I would just maybe speak to judgment on the other side when we feel judged, just learning to take a breath and recognize that it says more about that person's assumptions and where they are than it does about you. And to just kind of stay grounded in what you know about yourself and try not to take things personally when we're in a situation when we are on the other side of being judged. It takes a lot of humility on both sides of that.
I love that. Yeah, I think it's a double-edged coin, right? It's when we judge and when we feel judged, and we all do it to some level or another. And I think it's a nice reminder, scriptural reminder anyway, to kind of stop that when we can, or find reframes when we can. Along with kind of these ideas of the afterlife, I think number 6 thought that we've had about this is that, Mormonism was started by, whatever you think of Joseph Smith, my understanding, not being a historian, is that Joseph Smith, one of his concerns growing up in the religious kind of community he was a part of, some of the black and white ideas around the afterlife, especially in regards to an older brother of his who died very young. And so my understanding is that a lot of his curiosity about the afterlife and some of the framings that came, whether you believe that's through revelation or whether you believe he was biased or whatever story you put on that, but he kind of made more room, it seems like to me, than some of the classic Christian religions of his time for different possibilities, right? So there's the 3 kingdoms of heaven instead of heaven and hell, the way that, kind of the classic Christian narrative is around some of those things, and that there's a spirit prison, and that there's time to make different decisions in the afterlife. So that's why we do all these baptisms by proxy, because we're giving opportunity for those who didn't have the opportunity to maybe do a ritual that, hardcore Christianity, basically said, if you don't have these rituals, then even if you died as a baby and you weren't baptized as a baby, that's it. You're kind of lost forever to purgatory, right? These kinds of ideas that came from more hardcore Christianity, or maybe not hardcore, different sects of Christianity. So I always found it interesting that, a lot of our ideas about the afterlife in Mormonism do have more flexibility, kind of like what Jenny was saying, with mystery, more opportunity. We don't really know. And eternity is a long time. A lot of things can happen. We can't even wrap our heads around eternity for the most part in this world. And so a lot of time to figure it out. And that wasn't necessarily the message this last general conference, but it is a message that I have oftentimes heard from LDS pulpits, where it seems a more friendly approach to the afterlife, where people don't have to have major panic attacks and anxiety and distress in this life, worried about whether family members or they themselves are going to be worthy enough, perfect enough, good enough to make it to these things. And what's interesting about Mormon culture, again, is that even though the 3 heavens have all been said to be nice places, that's not good enough for us. We want the best of the best of the best. So even culturally, you can see some of the perfectionism coming out. Like, not only do I want to make the celestial kingdom, but there's even 3 kingdoms in that, and I want to make it to the top of that. And so there can be a lot of anxiety when we kind of take a linear approach instead of more of a flexible approach to some of these concepts. So any thoughts about just Mormon afterlife, and that makes it room for a little more healthy perspectives than harsh black or white perspectives?
So I'm trying to figure out I'm trying to find all the words. So this idea of, there's one place for everybody to get to is maybe an oversimplification for complicated people. So imagine you and your spouse and your 3 kids are going to go on a vacation. Maybe within the 5 of you can figure out a good destination. But then you start, okay, now let's invite grandma and grandpa. Now let's invite our aunts and our uncles and our cousins and our neighbors and our friends and all of these people. We all have to decide on one place that we're going to and how that's going to look like and what we're going to do when we get there. Man, that gets really complicated.
You mean that everybody want to go to Disneyland and stand in line?
I know. Yes. Come on. Everybody wants to go to Disneyland, right? And then when you get there, you're like, okay, we all have to have fun. We're running out of time. We got to make sure we're having fun. And but let's just remember we have time. We've got time to figure all of this out. It doesn't all have to be done now in the next week. Everybody agreeing to have one, set of beliefs, perhaps. We're complicated people. We're complicated.
I like that maybe that we're going to end up exactly where we want to end up is also another possibility. We may not all want to end up in the same place or looking place.
Well, and another way to say that we're complicated, but we're a complicated people that likes to try to make things very simple. Mm-hmm. We try to make it more simple than it is. We like to put things in our boxes, but so we have this plan of salvation. It's all laid out, and yet all you have to do, and I've heard this credited to Greg Prince. I didn't hear him say it myself, but I think it's brilliant. Is if you want to just throw a wrench into the idea that we know exactly what is going to happen in the afterlife, just ask someone, where do you go for Thanksgiving dinner? In Mormon heaven. I mean, think about that for a minute. It's not that easy. I mean, there are things we have no real good answer of what that really looks like anyway, that we're going to be with our families. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah, and I think the point that we're trying to make here is that we, in our office space, see a lot of angst over things that we're not sure we have very clear answers on. So it's almost kind of like the classic advice that you hear, like, don't worry about something until you have to worry about something, right? Like you can spend a lot of energy worrying and spending a lot of energy on concepts or things that you're assuming or that you're projecting or that you think are coming. And if those things don't happen, then you've just spent a lot of your energy focused on that outcome that never even came to pass. And so I think that's what we're kind of inviting you to consider, is that first of all, within Mormonism, there's a lot of room, floofy room out there that's I think a little more flexible than some of the classic Christian doctrines. And it invites you to maybe set aside this angst and worry that's making mortality very difficult for some people. Yeah,
for sure. And that lends right to a conversation I have with a lot of my clients, which is around mindfulness, which I've found is a really, really helpful tool for people who tend to maybe worry a lot about what that next life looks like, or what's going to happen with my loved ones, and I don't know what's happening here. Is that really, men are that they might have joy, and what we know about joy is that you can only experience it right now, in the here and now. And so paying attention to what is going on in your life right now and really nurturing and enjoying connections with people, those are the things that bring peace in the moment and bring joy in the moment. It's not the anxiety over what may or may not be coming.
Yeah, so we're already going into two more topics. So I love that it's like one topic leans into the next, because one of the things that we're talking about is we're talking about our ideas about heaven or the afterlife. And I got this first. I first was offered this reframe actually in Institute. What was back then, you see, I forget what it was. Utah Valley University is what it is now. But back in the day when I was there, I took some Institute classes at, I think it was UVCC at the time. And one of the Institute instructors offered us a different reframe on the word eternal. A lot of times we think of eternal as ongoing, right? So when you think about eternal punishment or eternal hell or eternal, it's like, holy cow, I'm going to be in the space of like, sadness and gnashing my teeth eternally. And he offered the reframe of eternal or even the idea of having full light and knowledge, meaning being of God, being divine. So these are eternal concepts. And that was very helpful for me because I tend to be somewhat anxiety ridden. And so I'm like, going eternal punishment was really freaking me out. So it was a very helpful reframe at that point in my life to think about it of the word eternal meaning something completely different that had nothing to do with timelines. It had more to do with being of divinity or of the next realm or something bigger than this mortal life. So I think with some of the conversations we've had about the afterlife and things like that, that's a helpful reframe. Any thoughts about that? Okay, so we can move on to joy. We actually have scripture that prioritizes joy. And so if we're having, a lot of fear or anxiety or sadness, there is kind of an invitation through this Mormon kind of narrative or the story to allow for the possibility of joy and happiness. And I love what you said, Jana, about that having to be felt right in the moment. It's not something that we're saying comes later. It's something that we have the right to experience in the moment. So any thoughts about how that can be a helpful concept?
Well, we need to think about where we're going to be getting joy from. I would imagine for a lot of us, that would be through our relationships, who we feel connected to, through our spouses and through our children, through parents and friends. How do you experience joy in those relationships? By spending time together, by being connected, by being open and vulnerable and sharing your different thoughts and beliefs and having fun together too.
Well, to your point, in the moment that you're talking about relationships, that makes me think we do not need to make differences of beliefs a barrier to experiencing joy with one another. And I find it very sad when I see that happening, when relationships are severed or harmed or avoided due to now a difference in belief, which we are experiencing a lot of that in our culture, in our Mormon culture, but even in religions at large. There's people that shift religions or shift from religion altogether, and from even belief in deity altogether. So how do we manage the joy of relationships in spite of differences in belief is a little bit of what I'm hearing you talking about, Jenny.
Yeah. And I think, the data show more and more people now are choosing not to be affiliated with any type of religion. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that. We have clients now who are coming to us for help with mixed faith marriages and families and how to manage that, how to preserve the relationship over, differences in beliefs. And because we all want that joy, we want that feeling of feeling connected and feeling like we belong somewhere in society, that we are validated. It's like hardwired in our brains and in our body to feel connected to people.
Love it.
And another thing that I would add about joy is that I think we have a little bit of a misconception sometimes just in our society in general and also within Mormonism about joy, that if we just do the right things all the time, we're going to feel joy, that's what it's about. And that if we're having some sort of negative feelings or emotions, we've done something wrong. It's some indication that we've done something wrong. And I just like to talk to clients about normalizing the bad feelings as well as the good, because counterintuitively, the better you are at actually feeling the bad stuff, the higher your ability to feel joy. The work of Brene Brown, she talks about the fact that we cannot selectively numb emotions. So if you're avoiding anger, if you're avoiding sadness, if you're avoiding other things that feel harder to you in your life, you're unwittingly actually numbing your joy as well. And so I just like to talk to people about allowing their feelings and letting them be indicators to them. And then understanding that joy comes more from, like what Jenny's talking about, it comes more from connection, it comes more from interactions with people than it does doing all the right things.
I love that. And that comes full circle with a little bit of what we talked about earlier, which is obedience and perfectionism although sometimes can be very helpful and can offer positive consequences, at the same time does not guarantee that. And there can be a lot of depression or anxiety or other types of mental health issues in people that are very righteous, in the sense righteous equating to behavioral conformity to kind of morals and values, right? So they might be checking off all the boxes and yet still find themselves in a state of depression. And that can be very confusing. So I really love that you're both complicating a lot of these kinds of ideas and how we don't want to simplify things. We want to actually complicate things so that we can find better ways of fitting in. How do we fit into all of these ideas in ways that can be strength-based, not that somehow we're lacking or being at fault. So great. All right, so moving on, we're on number 9. We thought the concept of love as the primary commandment was a good one. And since we're talking about relationships, that's a nice segue into that, that although we have the kind of classic 10 commandments, and we also have, a lot of other ideas of things that we should or shouldn't be doing. We're kind of expert at that in Mormon culture. It's pretty clear in the New Testament, and I think also in the Book of Mormon, if you're going to kind of adhere to the teachings of Jesus Christ, that love is the primary commandment, that out of all the principles out there, especially when we think about that wrestling between principles, that if you're going to wrestle, you should probably choose the one that comes from a space of love and acceptance. So that's, I think, a nice concept that's very relationally focused and healthy. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Natasha, I've never had someone come to me and say, I chose this really loving thing and it went terribly wrong for me. I've never had that happen. And so I think that we give a lot of lip service to that, but we forget it in the heat of some of these moral dilemmas that are super hard for us. And even when we're, going back to the judgment conversation, a lot of that becomes more clear when we can try to look at everything through a lens of love. I think it's a really important piece of theology that leads to, joy and all kinds of other things. If we can kind of set aside some of the complicating factors and look at it through a lens of love, certain things will become more clear to us. And we're open to personal revelation and all kinds of things when we are in a loving space.
So Jay Kuleski joins us, and his comment is, so God is allegedly good, right? And I'm guessing, Jay, maybe you missed a little bit of our intro. We're not here to necessarily say God is good or bad, or people have all different kinds of perceptions and relationships with the divine, including a non-belief in the divine, or that the divine isn't even a thing. So we're coming at this conversation just from the context of Mormonism, and for those who adhere to kind of a Mormon background and religious kind of framing, what are some of the things that you can find in Mormonism that might be more health promoting or help relationships more so than other concepts? So that's kind of where we're coming at this discussion. I think there's a lot of people who really struggle with that concept of whether or not God is good or bad or neutral or nothing in between, and whether or not God exists even. So that is something that is very personal in nature, and we honor all thoughts on the divine that people may come to. So and in fact, it's very important that as we're having this conversation from mental health perspective and a wellness perspective, that we are not imposing those things. We're just saying, if you're going to believe and if you're going to come from a Mormon context, as mental health professionals, here's some ideas that we think fit into mental health, relational health, versus maybe some more black or white thinking, rigid thinking, etc. So that's kind of, I guess, my thoughts about that. And I think that's where Jay was going, but I may have read too much into his comment. All right, so let's move then to number 10 concept that we think might be a helpful thing to consider, is faith. So the concept of faith, when really looked at from the definition of it, and you can find this definition in the Bible dictionary in Mormonism anyway, in the King James Bible that most people use in the Mormon congregations is that it is hope in something that is unseen. And so maybe this even goes back to some of our conversations about inviting mystery that Jenny brought up. And so that when you can have faith and hope in things that you don't necessarily for sure know about, that does offer some flexibility versus knowledge, which means you know. And I think sometimes in Mormon culture, we hear a lot of I knows, and it can be difficult to trump an I know, especially if that I know is coming from a leadership position that is at a higher kind of authority level than you are at, right? Which goes back to some of our ideas about personal revelation and things of that nature. So I think it can be very helpful when we consider faith as something that we don't know, but that we have hope for or that we believe. And are those things that propel us towards health and, positive outlooks versus anxiety and difficult outcomes. Any thoughts about faith and how that can be helpful or not helpful concept?
Yeah, I think that we have really in Mormonism conflated the word faith with belief. And we kind of talk about those synonymously or interchangeably. And I notice when people start to have challenges to their faith, that's how we always talk about it. And yet it's when I get in conversations with them, typically it's a challenge to their belief. And so I like to complicate that idea of faith. And like you said, I think that often we are tempted to say that the opposite of faith is doubt. Faith and doubt can't coexist. And I would actually say that faith can't exist without doubt. It's actually the opposite of faith is certainty. When we've got it all figured out, when we know, there is no room for faith. So it really isn't until we are able to say we actually have absolutely no idea with a certainty if this thing is how it is, or if God exists or any of that. It is only until we acknowledge that there's no way for us to know that faith can actually start. And so with that comes a measure, again, of humility and openness and being okay with questions and being okay with uncertainty and paradox. That's really the only way, and mystery, it's only the only way for faith to start to really flourish. But that's a scary thing. It's much more comfortable to say that we know and we're certain of something and it can't be any other way. That feels good. But I would say that in a lot of ways that's antithetical to faith.
I love that, especially because doubting is such a human thing to be doing. And so if we are deprecating for just a normal thing, which is to question and doubt, and actually, again, from the Mormon story, that's kind of where the Mormon story begins, right? Is with a questioning, doubting person that goes to seek for answers. It's a much healthier framework when what happens naturally as a human being is something that's seen as normal, good, that will propel you towards growth and development instead of trying to shut people down on something that's going to happen anyway, because then you're setting people up to fail, right? And we don't want to set people up to fail. We want to set people up for feeling confident about their spiritual journeys or religious journeys or whatever language they might want to use for that. Jenny, thoughts from you on that perspective?
Wow, you guys said everything I was thinking so beautifully. I don't know what more to say about faith. I agree with all you said so far.
Yeah. So then, and Jay says, he continues by saying, I'm really worried about my mental health over my same-sex attractiveness. And he also shares that I have my faith, but I'm so conflicted. And so this is one area of the many, many areas that could present, for example, in our offices where people have natural inclinations or things that are coming up for them that then are wrestling with their values or their perceived ideas of what is correct or righteous. And when the community at large also has a lot to say about that, which we do, for example, with LGBTQ plus issues, then it can very easily set up these conflicts that Jay is describing, which we would see as normal that you're conflicted, normal that you're struggling in that way, and that's an excellent time to, get some type of perspective from people who are culturally competent, who will honor your values, honor your religious ideas, and also invite you to think outside of the kind of box per se, right? Which is a lot of what we're doing in therapy and coaching work, is we're inviting people to think outside the prescribed box, so that you can find ways that are going to fit your concepts. And this is why concepts like agency and personal revelation and all these things that we're trying to kind of glean out of Mormonism can be very helpful principles, and why people can have different ways that it looks. The picture may look different, and yet they may have a very healthy, way of approaching their lives. So thank you, Jay, for that vulnerability.
Yeah, I would just say that a lot of these things, like the one that Jay is bringing up, it is one of, I don't think you can go very far in life or do much study without some sort of cognitive dissonance come up over the way that you are internalizing whatever religion or whatever belief system you have been brought up with. There are always contradictions. Life is just far more messy than the easy doctrinal lines we try to draw around everything. And so I think he's bringing up a really important point, which is when especially something as core to your experience in life as maybe a sexual identity or gender identity or any of those things, when that is coming up in a very paradoxical way against your religious identity, then there's a lot of room for work in framing that as a very paradoxical situation that cannot be figured out with just our heads. And so it's an invitation automatically into really deep personal revelation and questions of your own deep faith and a mature spirituality that is more felt and experienced than it is figured out in your head, because you will never be able to fully solve a paradoxical situation just with your brain.
And I really liked what you said earlier about belief being different than faith. I think that's a really important thing to consider. For those of you who are familiar with Jana Colvin, and she does a podcast called A Thoughtful Faith, and she likes to say, I'm having a belief crisis, not a faith crisis, right? Which means that I can be a person of faith, which means I do hope for the unseen, and I hope for all kinds of things. I may not adhere to certain beliefs anymore, or I may have shifted some of the ways I believe about God or about spirituality or all these things, but that doesn't make me a person of non-faith, which again is a way that we kind of otherize people in our community, how we talk about these things, that you've lost your faith, that you've lost your testimony, that somehow makes you less worthy or less valiant or less whatever the word is that we insert. And so we can be people of faith, we can be people of hope, we can be people of belief, but it may or may not have the same belief that we once had, and that doesn't make us less than. So I really like that thought.
I like to broaden the definition of faith, because the word in Greek, it's pistis or pistis. I don't know. I'm not Greek. I don't know how to pronounce it perfectly, but P-I-S is the word that was translated into our current New Testaments as faith. It's coming from that word. And back then it embodied a whole lot more than just belief. It was a relationship word. It's a relationship word of our relationship with God, God's relationship with us. And it makes sense if we put it in the context of, I have faith in my friends that they've got my back. I have faith that I have things in line that I'm going to be able to pay my bills this month. I don't know for sure with any of these things, but I have faith, and it's more of a relationship kind of an idea. I trust that the universe or the divine or God or whatever has my back, and that I'm trustworthy. And when you think about it that way, it opens up more possibilities of this question of faith than just, do I believe certain creeds?
Love it. So moving along with this, you brought up a thought, Jana, that I'm going to have you expound on, Jenny. You brought up that doubt is something that is normal and actually part of faith. So number 11 point is this idea about discomfort. Is it okay to feel discomfort? And because a lot of times I think sometimes discomfort is equated to, oh, that means it comes from evil or Satan or, things of that nature. But Jenny, do you want to talk a little bit about how the concepts of discomfort are something that we can embrace in Mormon thought processes?
Well, I think as humans, we tend to be, we don't want to feel uncomfortable. That's like the worst thing ever. If I live in Florida, and if I don't have my AC set at the certain temperature all the time, I feel really hot or I'm really, really cold. I gotta find the right equilibrium that's perfect for me. And this idea of being uncomfortable is uncomfortable, right? But when we need to be, it's okay to feel uncomfortable. I like what you're saying, Natasha, that it doesn't mean, when we're talking about a religious, construct, it doesn't mean it coming from someplace evil. It means that we're noticing a difference. So something different here. And what is this difference that's coming up? What does this mean? There's probably an emotion attached to it. I'm feeling fear about something. Why am I feeling fear? Because there seems to be some kind of threat here. So we need to notice what we're feeling uncomfortable about and what is the threat that we think that we are having. And that will help us move a little bit through the process of learning to be more comfortable with that state of uncomfortableness.
Love it.
Yeah,
that's a better word. Discomfort.
And so often when we're in that space of discomfort with cognitive dissonance, we are so tempted, we want to get out of that feeling. And so we often feel like we need to choose one or the other. We need to figure out which one is right and which one is wrong. And so I'll also often invite people to see if they could make a both and out of that situation. Is it possible that maybe there's a third option, a third way to look at it? Maybe I have some assumptions that are making me think I only have two ways to go here. And so how can we complicate that and look at our assumptions and how that's driving what we feel like we need to do to get out of this discomfort?
Yeah, and going back to even our thoughts about pain and joy and even the plan of happiness where we had the agency to choose, I think if you're going to buy into that whole Mormon story, it guarantees discomfort. It's not that we were supposed to live a comfort-free life. And so I think that the invitation that we're giving is that any type of growth is going to require discomfort. And so we know that in the mental health field. And I think that what we want to be careful about in a Mormon construct is not just say, oh, well, if I have, for example, a gay son and I'm uncomfortable with that, then that automatically means that there's something wrong with my gay son or my son being gay, right? And so that's where we want to invite this idea that discomfort is maybe something we're supposed to sit with. It's how we grow. The church has gone through a lot of uncomfortable changes, throughout history where we've had to check some of our own biases and discriminations. And so that it is part of growth, and it doesn't have to be this, like you're saying, Jana, black and white narrative. It can be a yes and not just assume that it's coming from a bad place or that this is wrong or evil or bad because I'm uncomfortable. So, yes. And that's hard. It's hard because we want to project our own values or our own ideas onto maybe our grown children or our spouse or friends or ward members that we interact with.
Actually, absolutely. And it can actually be, if we're not very aware of what we're doing, it can be a very subtle way of spiritually bypassing our own growth by saying, oh, that's uncomfortable, therefore it must be the spirit withdrawing or telling me that something is wrong with this. And so keeping in mind that when things are new, when things seem to on the surface be a conflict, that can also cause discomfort. So just widening our language around that, because people who really are averse to that kind of conflict, I don't think intentionally, that can even unintentionally start avoiding the very things that are going to bring us that growth, and using that as I mean, I hate using it as an excuse, but somehow it lets us off the hook for actually diving into the thing that's going to bring us the growth by just saying that is something to be avoided.
Love it. All right. So anybody want to talk about the concept of ongoing revelation? This is kind of something that's somewhat unique to Mormonism, is this idea that we don't have all the answers, or that scripture isn't closed per se, or that we have a right to an ongoing relationship with deity that continues to be open to answering things. Is that a helpful concept, and why?
I think it's really helpful. It helps us have, still retain some sort of uncertainty, retain some sort of humility that maybe we don't have it all figured out right now, that maybe there is more good that is coming. I think sometimes we like to, we like to put things in a nice little bow. Everything has been restored and now we know everything, and that feels really, really good. But if you look closely at the history of Mormonism at all, you will recognize that we continually change things because we don't have it all figured out. And that's okay. And we've been told numerous times that this is a continuing thing of restoration. It hasn't all happened, and there's more and more coming, and we always get better with time. And I think we also need to remember that Joseph Smith was very much about acquiring truth from many different places. Nowhere did he say all truth is going to come through me. He kind of looked at us as a receptacle of goodness, and that we accept all things that are good. And so sometimes we get a little nervous to look outside and see if there are other things that are maybe good, or we get confused if we find good in other places. But I don't think there needs to be a conflict, that we just, again, through that guide of personal revelation, we're invited to look around at everything, to learn, and then to determine for ourselves what is really good.
I love that. Jenny, you had brought up the concept of mercy and grace, as so I'm going to make that number 13 on our list. What are your thoughts about those types of concepts that maybe, again, culturally aren't focused on a lot in Mormonism? We tend to be doers, and we love our checklists and our tasks in Mormonism, but we do believe in mercy and grace. So what are some ways that can be a helpful framing?
So in the same idea of ongoing revelation, that's where we got these ideas of mercy and grace. We find those concepts in the New Testament. Old Testament teachings are a lot about thou shalt not. So it's a big list of things that you should and should not do. And then the New Testament came along with Jesus Christ and the idea of that he's overcoming and he's got the good news. And this idea of mercy and grace is that, yeah, we don't have it all figured out, and you guys are not going to figure it all out on your own. And that's okay, because I'm here for you. So I had to look up the definitions of mercy and grace myself just to make sure I understood the difference myself, because they seem kind of the same thing, but they're kind of not the same thing. So mercy is when God is not punishing us, even though our sin deserved punishment. And grace is when God blesses us, even though we don't deserve it. So, when we fall short, or when we know we mess up, just like we do in parenting, when our kids mess up, we say, this is what you did wrong, but it's okay. We can figure this out. You can do a little bit better, and I'm going to help you out with that. I think that's kind of where that idea of mercy comes in. And so when we get faced with a talk or an idea or a revelation that's difficult, we can remember that, it's taught in the New Testament that God will be merciful. He will know your heart, and he will know what you've been struggling with and what you've been pondering in your own hearts. I love that concept.
Yeah, this whole idea that we need to deserve everything, or that we earn everything, or that somehow it's a kind of a very justice, type of idea. And in some ways, even our legal system works that way. We don't just dole out punishments, just willy-nilly. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into intent and circumstances and priors, and I mean, like we
Mhm.
kind of take the context of the situation, even in our justice system, to have people that with maybe similar behaviors having very different results in what happens with their hearings per se. And so I think this is kind of a relational concept, that we have mercy and grace given the context of the situation. And what better, if you're going to have a belief in deity, what better way of having a relationship with a universal force that has your back, like you said, that can comfort and that can ease when we fall short, which we all do. So I think that's a very helpful concept. Jana, anything you would add to those concepts?
Nothing to add. I would just say that, when I first heard that definition of grace, I remember hearing that, I don't know, sometime in the last few years, because we don't really talk about grace in those terms necessarily. I haven't heard it much, but understanding that it is a gift that is absolutely not deserved. You did nothing to earn it, not one thing. That's another one of those paradoxical situations we've got going between works and grace. But I just remember, as a recovering perfectionist myself, being really struck by that. Like, oh, it's not grace unless I didn't earn it. So, I mean, it is built into the system, and I have to remind myself all the time, it is built into the foundation of our theology, that we're going to make mistakes. And yet it's so hard for us when we do. I understand the checklist and the difficulty of trying to live through a checklist, but it's another invitation into a deeper place to try to understand how these paradoxical things work together, and to really allow that grace in.
Right. I love it. Okay. Number 14 is the whole concept of eternal families, meaning that we thought that this was indicative of a message of how important relationships are, that we take relationships very seriously in kind of a Mormon construct. And so I guess it's very ironic or tragic for me when I see the concept of eternal families tearing families apart, because we're so worried that we're not going to be an eternal family, that then we act really badly towards our families right now, and lots of hurt feelings and lots of and it can be on either side of the belief aisle. It doesn't have to be, just believers towards non or non towards believers. It tends to happen in a lot of ways that we can be really, quite frankly, awful to each other just because of, again, things. So how would the two of you talk about this concept of eternal families and kind of the messaging of family relationship being very important in Mormonism as an opportunity to be relationally healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of, like you said, it's kind of a tragedy to think that we're so family oriented, and yet so often it's our very families that take a hit. And just what I notice is typically under all of that is fear. Fear because we love our families and we want all of us to make it. And we have this theology that's promising something that we'll all be together. And then when there's a hint that maybe it's not, there's usually some kind of fear underneath driving all of that unkind behavior. And so I just like people to kind of just take a step back and notice what their fears are that are driving all of this. And then I think it's healthy to bring back some of these concepts of uncertainty and, maybe not having it all figured out. How literally am I trying to interpret things? And again, who do we invite for Thanksgiving dinner? I think that there's room within the theology, and there's enough that we don't know to say that this may be a far grander plan and grander concept than we really understand. So I just think focusing on that fact that relationship is obviously important. And I think that's because it does refine us. It shows us who we are, and it invites us into deeper and deeper compassion and all of the traits that we're going to want to have in the eternities to come, hopefully we are just learning. It's a laboratory for learning more and more compassion and love. And if we find that the specifics are tearing us apart, perhaps we need to take a step back from the specifics and see what fears are driving that.
Love it. Jenny, any thoughts about families and relationships?
I think Jana and I are speaking or thinking along the same wavelength here. I was going to talk about, that when we notice that we have this thing that's very, very important to us and we don't want to lose the thing, we get a little panicky about losing the thing. That's what we're talking about, fear. Fear is hardwired in our brain, in the amygdala part of our brain. That's where we have our fight, flight, or freeze response to anything that we perceive to be a threat. And when that gets activated, sometimes it shuts down the thinking part of our brains. And when the thinking part of our brain gets shut down, we don't always behave in the best ways. So if we can understand what might be driving that behavior of the unkindness and it can show up as aggression too, like we have to, we must to, we have to, or everything will be lost type of thing. If we can speak to the fear behind that. And the fear is really because we cherish the thing that we don't want to lose. And so if we recognize, the loss that could potentially happen, maybe depending on your belief system, but shift it to, like Jana said, taking a step back and noticing what's here and in the now. It's really helpful also when you kind of have that anxiety to notice what you can control in your life. So what are the things right now in your life? What's happening in your relationship now that you can control? Well, I can control how I talk to my loved ones. I can control about what things we talk about. I can control how much time we spend together. So those are the things that you should be thinking about as well.
Love it. I love that. And number 15 that we came up with is something that just stood out to me one time when I was kind of going through my scriptures, is how often I read the very simple scripture, oftentimes just stands alone or in a very short type of passage where it's an invitation to do not fear, do not fear. And we hear that over and over and over again, this invitation to not fear, which, given everything you just both said about fear and how that can be a very instinctual and very primitive and very primary emotion, the invitation to step beyond that initial instinct is a constant one that we get. And, and I would hope that if people stay engaged in a religious community or religious belief system, that it would be something that propels them and edifies them and isn't scaring them or keeping them in anxious, depressed spaces. So I think however we're going to use our religion, whether we stay in it or whether we leave it, regardless of what direction you go, hopefully you're finding spaces that are not fear-based, right? That are not motivated by fear or keeping you in fearful spaces where you're constantly in self-doubt, constantly anxious about the future or anxious about the afterlife or things of that nature. I don't think that's the intent of a lot of these spiritual principles and teachings that are found, in our tradition. So I would just kind of end with that invitation. I don't know if if either one of you want to expound on that thought.
No, I love that. The only thing I would say is sometimes it's really hard to recognize actually when we're operating from fear. Sometimes that's really hidden from us. And one of the telltale signs that I share with people is when you find yourself wanting to control something, or if you see someone else trying to control you or to control situations, that is a red light flashing that there is fear driving those kinds of behaviors. So that can just be a tip of something to look for in yourself or in someone else in a situation that's pointing at maybe there's a fear to look for here.
Yeah, good. Any final thoughts from you, Jenny, on that one or anything else?
Oh, with fear, I like to teach my clients about how to get in tune with the body and notice where it shows up in the body. Does it show up as a nervous stomach? Does it show up as a racing heart? Does your brain kind of get foggy? Do your hands get a little sweaty? That's kind of your indication that something's a little bit off for you, and maybe you should learn to calm yourself down, take a break, be distracted for a little while before engaging in any kind of meaningful conversation with people.
Wonderful. Well, and I just want to kind of close off the conversation. I know that it's super late, especially for Jenny, who's Eastern time. So thanks for hanging in there with us. But I am very aware that pretty much every single, out of these 15 ideas, people could look up scripture or quotes or all kinds of things that contradict everything that we just said. I'm very, very aware that that's possible. And this is maybe, I'm just imposing a whole nother idea on this is an umbrella idea for this whole thing, is that, you hear the term cafeteria Mormon, as something that we should avoid. And yet there's no way. There's no way. We are all in some way, shape, or another, if you consider yourself a Mormon, a cafeteria Mormon, because all of these principles have, just like there's scriptures on how you shouldn't fear, there's scriptures on how you should fear. And just like there's scriptures on how you shouldn't judge, there's scriptures on how you should judge. And, just like there's conference talks that say things like, we're an umbrella organization and we welcome everybody. There's other conference talks that will be very specific about really who isn't welcome or who needs to repent and, much more kind of strict ways of thinking about things. So our whole agenda of sharing this podcast with you tonight is that we tend to see that perfectionism, rigidity, leaning too much towards obedience, where there isn't personal adult authenticity and room for agency, tend to not be spaces where mental health tends to thrive. And yet there are many spaces, and we think concepts within Mormonism that could either be used better or more often, or that certain people within Mormonism use very well and they're thriving. And so we want to just help kind of make sure that we're opening up the discussion for within the concept, within the tradition of Mormonism, what are some of the things that we might see as offering flexibility, offering personal autonomy, offering growth, offering differentiation, all of these things that tend to be supported by the research and the work of mental and social health. So that's what tonight was about. We, again, are not trying to impose our own God or our own beliefs on any one person. These are things that we think are helpful within a Mormon construct. Some of us may believe these things. Some of us may not believe these things. That's not even the point. The point is what within the construct could potentially be used in health-affirming, relationship-centered ways. And since we oftentimes will critique or will point out ways that maybe are not healthy, we want to make sure we're doing some on the other side as well, right? Like there are healthy things. Can we gravitate towards those things in our community and in our tradition? So that's kind of my closing thoughts. Jana, Jenny, any closing thoughts from you as far as what you were hoping to kind of generally offer as part of this podcast?
No, I think you summed it up really beautifully. Yep. Wanted to offer some strategies and things for people that, that I see in my office quite often, and some of the things that tend to help us through those things, because there really is so much more flexibility sometimes than we give ourselves credit for and we give the church credit for. And so when we hear things from the pulpit, sometimes we think there's just one way to go with that. And so I just love offering people, I like to complicate things for people and help them understand that there's more than one way to do this thing.
Great. Jenny, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, more than one way to do this thing, and therefore let us all be hopeful. Let's go away from this podcast feeling hopeful that we can, as a group, as a family, as a community, as a society, we can learn to love all the different types of belief maybe, and the variation in belief, and really focus on the relationships. The relationships are what are most important.
All right, wonderful. Bringing us back to the number one commandment. So full circle. All right, for those of you who enjoy Mormon Mental Health Podcast and find it valuable, please consider a financial donation, which is what we need to keep this podcast alive and well. And you can do that at mormonmentalhealth.org. There's other ways you can support us as well. You can like our Facebook page. You can interact with us on these Facebook Lives when we have them. Thank you for those of you who did place comments. You can give us a positive review on Facebook or iTunes or YouTube, all the different places that we're at, because that helps give us a positive rating so that other people will see that and try the content out. You can share this with your family or friends or ecclesiastical leaders where you might find some of these ideas helpful or necessary in your communities, depending on the topic that we're presenting on. So thanks for all of your support. And Jana and Jenny, thank you for hanging in there on kind of a longer type podcast. We have 15 items to get through. So thank you for your time. And we'll see you soon. You can find about Jana and Jenny at symmetrysouls.com if you want to learn more about them and what they have to offer. And have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown way before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest Then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not.